My name is Audrey Hale. I am 34 years old, and the morning my father stood at the head of a Mother's Day brunch table and wept about how little his daughter loved him. He was wearing a linen shirt I had paid for, sitting in a chair I had bought, in a dining room furnished with money that had left my account in 47 separate transfers over 5 years. The brunch was my Aunt Patricia's idea. She believed in occasions. She believed that a properly set table with the right flowers and the right napkin rings could smooth over almost anything, and she had been testing that theory against my family for decades with mixed results. The guest list was the usual assembly: 3 aunts, 2 uncles, 4 cousins who had grown up and become strangers with familiar faces. My grandmother on my mother's side, who was 81 and had the specific gift of saying devastating things in a voice that made them sound like compliments. My daughter Rosie was 7 years old and sitting beside me with a glass of orange juice. She was holding with both hands the way she held things she considered important. My mother sat across from me looking pale in the way she had looked pale for as long as I could remember, which I had believed for years was a medical condition and had only recently understood was also a performance. My father stood and cleared his throat. He was a tall man who had learned early that height was most effective when combined with silence before speaking. He used the silence now, letting the table settle into attention the way a conductor waits for quiet before the first note. He said that Mother's Day was a time to reflect on what family meant. He said that his wife had given everything for her children and asked for nothing in return. He said that a parent's love was unconditional, which in his telling meant it operated entirely in one direction. Then his voice broke. He said that he sometimes lay awake wondering what he had done wrong. He said that a daughter who loved her work more than her family was a particular kind of loneliness for a father to carry. He said that some people found it easier to care for objects than for the people who had sacrificed everything to raise them. He pressed his fingers to his eyes. He said, "I just want my daughter to choose us sometimes. That is all I have ever asked." The table was very quiet. My Aunt Patricia had her hand over her mouth. My grandmother nodded slowly. My cousin Derek, who had not spoken to me in 2 years because I had declined to lend him money, looked at me with something that wanted to be disappointment. Rosie put her orange juice down and looked at my face. "I want to stop here and ask you something directly. Where are you watching this from right now? Because I want to know how many people are sitting somewhere in the world who have heard a version of that speech, dressed differently, aimed at them across a different table, at a different occasion that was really just a stage. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is, because this story belongs to more people than just me." The version of Audrey Hale that my father presented to that table was consistent and had been refined over many years. In his telling, I was a woman who had retreated into a narrow obsession with old machines, who had chosen gears and springs over human connection, who had been given love freely and returned it poorly. I was competent in a way that embarrassed the family, because my competence lived in a workshop and not in a kitchen or a church hall or anywhere visible. That story was easier than the true one. The true one required arithmetic. I became a horological conservator, which is the formal name for what I do, through a path that my father had called a waste of a university education, until the income started, and then called clever, without ever adjusting the original assessment. I restore antique timepieces, pocket watches from the 19th century, bracket clocks with verge escapements, marine chronometers that once sailed on ships whose names nobody remembers, long case clocks with painted dials and weights that have not moved in 40 years. The work is precise and solitary and requires a particular kind of patience that has nothing to do with personality and everything to do with understanding that something broken can be understood completely, if you are willing to take it apart carefully enough. I had built a small reputation over 8 years. Conservation work for 2 regional museums, private clients who collected seriously and paid accordingly, a waiting list that ran to 14 months. The workshop was a converted single-story space behind my house, temperature and humidity controlled, with benches I had built myself and lighting that cost more than most people spent on furniture. It was not a glamorous business. It was a serious one. There is a difference that not everyone can see. My father had never entered my workshop without asking first, which I had once taken as respect, and later understood was a form of distance from something he could not control or perform for. 5 years before the Mother's Day brunch, my mother had a cardiac event. Not the large kind, but not small either. It required a stent and a hospital stay and a recalibration of how the family talked about her health, which had always been a topic, but now became the topic, the central fact around which all other family decisions were organized. I drove 4 hours to be there the night it happened. I stayed for 3 weeks. I arranged the follow-up appointments and drove her to them, and sat in the waiting rooms with a notebook so I could write down what the cardiologist said and explain it to my father afterward, in language that did not frighten him. I also, during those 3 weeks, looked at their finances for the first time. I had offered to help with some bills while I was there, and my father had handed me a folder with the particular casualness of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask. Inside the folder was a credit card statement with a balance that took me a moment to process. Then a second card. Then a third. The mortgage had 3 months of late payment notices tucked behind them. I asked my father to explain the balances. He explained them the way people explain things they have decided not to examine. Costs had increased. Medical expenses were ongoing. Things had gotten complicated. He did not mention the brokerage account. I found that later, when I was helping them organize documents for a refinancing application. The account had been opened 4 years earlier. It had been funded with a series of transfers from their joint checking account. It had lost a significant amount of money in a series of trades that followed a pattern I recognized from the language my father used. Quick returns, a system he had read about, a friend who had made money the same way. He had not mentioned the brokerage account, because mentioning it would have required explaining it, and explaining it would have required acknowledging that the credit card balances and the late mortgage payments were not the result of medical costs or rising prices. They were the result of money that had been gambled away systematically over 4 years, while my parents presented to their neighborhood and their extended family the image of people who were managing fine. I paid the credit cards down, not all at once, because all at once would have made it a conversation, and I had learned early that making things a conversation in my family meant becoming the subject of the conversation, rather than the problem. I transferred money each month in amounts that reduced the balances without triggering the questions that a large payment would have raised. I covered the mortgage shortfalls 6 times over 2 years, then more regularly after that. I paid for the follow-up cardiac tests that fell outside my mother's insurance coverage. I paid for the medication that was cheaper through a private prescription than through the plan they were on. I paid for the new refrigerator when the old one stopped working, and my father called me at 11 at night with the particular urgency he reserved for things that required money without warning. In return, I received the ongoing story of my mother's fragility, delivered to me in regular installments. Her heart was not strong. The stress of financial worry could damage it. If things became too difficult, the consequences for her health were unpredictable. I was not told this cruelly. I was told this the way a person shares a medical fact, in a tone that made concern and obligation indistinguishable. I believed it because I loved her, and because loving someone makes you want to believe the version of the story that gives your sacrifice a purpose. The total across 5 years, when I finally put it all in one document, was not a comfortable number. It included the credit card payments, the mortgage support, the medical expenses, and the various other amounts that had left my account for reasons that were always urgent, and always just this once, and always followed within a few months by the next urgent thing. I printed the figure at the bottom of the last page and looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at my workshop. Then I looked at my daughter, who was sleeping in the next room and would one day ask me what I had built with my working years, and I thought about what I was going to tell her. At the Mother's Day brunch, while my father was still speaking, I opened my laptop. I had been carrying it in a bag, and my Aunt Patricia had given it a look when I brought it in, the kind of look people give things that do not belong at a family occasion. I had said I might need it for something, and she had decided to allow it. I had spent 3 evenings preparing the document. It was a simple spreadsheet reformatted for presentation. Clean columns, clear labels, a color system that made the categories easy to follow. I had connected my laptop to the small projector I used for client presentations when I was showing a collector before and after documentation of a restoration. I had set the projector on the sideboard the previous evening when I arrived to help Patricia with the setup, and nobody had asked about it because it was small and I had placed it behind the centerpiece, where it was not immediately visible. My father finished speaking. The table offered him the silence of people who had decided he was right. I said, "Dad, I appreciate you sharing that. I have something I would like to share as well. My Aunt Patricia looked uncertain. My mother looked at the tablecloth. My father sat down with the composure of a man who believed he had already won the room. I turned the projector on. The spreadsheet appeared on the wall behind the sideboard, above the framed watercolor of a coastal scene that Patricia had owned for 30 years. The columns were immediately legible. Date, amount, purpose, running total, I said. This is a record of the financial transfers I have made to my parents over the past 5 years. I have organized it by category so it is easier to follow. The room was very quiet. I walked them through it. Not quickly, not with drama, the way I would walk a client through a conservation report, with precision and without apology. The credit card payments and their dates. The mortgage supplements, labeled with the month and the amount of the shortfall covered. The medical expenses with the corresponding appointment records. The appliance and household emergency payments, individually listed. Then I advanced to the second slide. I said, "This is a record of the transfers my parents made from their joint account to their brokerage account over the same period, which I found when I was helping them with financial paperwork 2 years ago." My mother made a sound that was not a word. I said, "The brokerage account lost a significant amount of money during this period. The losses correspond closely in timing to the increases in credit card balance that I was asked to help cover. I am not raising this to assign blame. I am raising it because a story was told at this table this morning about a daughter who does not love her parents. I want the people at this table to have complete information when they decide what they think about that story." My father said my name in a voice that was supposed to stop me. It was the voice he had used my entire childhood to mark the edge of what was permitted. I had spent 34 years stopping at that edge. I advanced to the final slide. It was a single number. The total. Beneath it, I had written one sentence. This is what love looked like from my side of the table. My cousin Derek was looking at the projection with his mouth slightly open. My grandmother had put on her reading glasses, which she normally resisted in company. My Aunt Patricia had sat down. My mother said, "Audrey, we were going to pay it back." I said, "I know you believe that." My father stood up. His voice had changed from the weeping register to something lower and harder. He said I had humiliated them in front of family. He said this was not how a daughter behaved. He said he did not know what had happened to me. I said, "I know you believe that too." Then I closed the laptop, turned off the projector, and sat down. Rosie had been watching me the whole time. She picked up her orange juice again and drank from it carefully, holding it with both hands. The brunch concluded without dessert. I want to be honest about the months that followed because stories like this are sometimes told as if a single moment of clarity resolves everything that comes after it. That is not what happened. My father called me 14 times in the 2 weeks after the brunch. The calls progressed through several phases. The first phase was anger, which I had expected. The second phase was a revised injury, in which he was now hurt by my public behavior, rather than by my alleged emotional absence. The third phase was negotiation, which arrived in the form of a call from my Aunt Patricia, who wanted me to understand that my father had not been well, and that stress was bad for my mother's heart. That sentence, "Stress is bad for my mother's heart," had been the operating system of my family for 5 years. I had run on it, budgeted around it, structured my working hours to accommodate it. I recognized it now the way you recognize a song after someone explains what it was actually written about. The melody is the same. The meaning is different. My mother called once, late on a Tuesday evening. She did not mention the money or the projection or the brunch. She asked whether Rosie had started swimming lessons yet. I said yes. She said that was good, that every child should know how to swim. Then she said she hoped I was eating properly. I said I was. Then there was a long silence that held everything we were not saying. I said good night. She said good night. We were both telling the truth. 4 months after the Mother's Day brunch, my father had a stroke. It was not severe in the clinical sense. The damage was to an area that affected his left-hand coordination and produced some lasting fatigue. He was hospitalized for 8 days and discharged with a rehabilitation plan and a list of modifications the house would need. My Aunt Patricia called to tell me. She said the family thought I should come home. She said, this was a time when past difficulties needed to be set aside. She said my mother could not manage alone, and that in situations like this, a daughter's place was clear. I listened to all of it. Then, I said that I was sorry my father was unwell, and that I hoped his rehabilitation went smoothly. I said I would contribute to the cost of professional home care if that would help. I said I had researched several agencies that specialized in post-stroke support and could send the information. Patricia said that professional care was not the point. I said I understood that was how she saw it. I said that I had spent 5 years providing what I had been told was essential support to my parents, and that during those 5 years the framing had consistently been that nothing I provided was the real thing, that the real thing was my physical presence, and my willingness to subordinate my work and my life to whatever the current emergency required. I said I was no longer available to be the solution to that particular problem. She said she did not recognize me. I said I was not sure she had ever recognized me accurately. I want to tell you about the clock tower. There is a municipal building in a town 3 hours from where I live that has a clock tower that has not run correctly in 11 years. The mechanism is an early 20th century movement, weight-driven, with a Graham deadbeat escapement and a pendulum that is longer than I am tall. The town had never found anyone willing to take on the restoration at a price they could manage, and with the access complications that a working public building presented. I had been in correspondence with the building's historical trust for 2 years. We had finally reached an agreement on terms and timeline. The restoration was scheduled to begin the same week my Aunt Patricia called about my father's stroke. I arranged accommodation in the town. I packed the tools I would need for the initial assessment. I talked to Rosie about what we were going to do. Rosie was 7 and had grown up watching me work. She understood that a clock was not a decoration. She understood that it was a system, that every part of it was in a relationship with every other part, and that the purpose of the whole thing was to measure something that moved in only one direction. She asked me once why anyone would want a clock that did not work. I said that sometimes people forgot what a thing was for, and that the job was to remind it. She thought about that and said that seemed hard. I said it was, but that the result was worth the difficulty. We drove to the town on a Sunday morning with the windows down, because Rosie preferred it, and I had decided that there were preferences worth honoring without negotiation. She asked questions about the clock tower for most of the drive. How old was it? How big were the weights? Could you hear it from inside? What did it sound like when it first started running again after a long time stopped? I told her that moment, the first tick after a long silence, was the reason I did the work. She said she wanted to hear it. I said she would. The building's curator met us in the car park. He was a man in his 60s who had grown up in the town and remembered the clock running from his childhood, and then watched it stop, and had spent 11 years writing grant applications and talking to committees about why it mattered. He shook my hand and then crouched down and shook Rosie's hand as well, which she accepted with great seriousness. He took us up through the building to the clock room. The movement occupied a space the size of a large wardrobe, iron-framed, layered with 11 years of dust, and the accumulated grime of 11 years before that. The pendulum hung motionless. The maintaining power spring had relaxed completely. Several of the clickwork components needed immediate attention before anything else could be addressed. I put on my magnifiers and began the assessment. Rosie sat on a folding chair the curator had brought for her and watched me work with the focused silence she used for things she was genuinely interested in, which was a quality I recognized because it was one I had passed to her without knowing I was doing it. After an hour, the curator went downstairs to deal with some administrative matter, and it was just the 2 of us in the clock room with the light coming through the tower windows and the smell of old oil and stone. Rosie said, "Mom, did Grandpa really say you don't love them?" I said, "Yes, he did." She thought about this. Then she said, "But you paid their house." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is weird." I said it was. She asked why he said it then. I said that sometimes people tell a story so many times that they start to believe it, even when the evidence is right in front of them. I said that had been true of Grandpa for a long time. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Will the clock know it has been stopped?" I said clocks did not know things the way people knew things. But I said that there was a sense in which time that passes while a clock is simply gone. You cannot recover it. When the clock runs again, it runs from now. It does not go back and fill in the missing years. She considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, "That is kind of sad." I said it was. I said it was also just true. My mother came to visit me 6 weeks after my father's discharge from the hospital. She came alone, which was something she had not done in the years I could clearly remember. She drove herself, which the cardiologist had said was fine, and which my father had apparently not been able to prevent once she had decided to do it. She sat in my kitchen and drank tea and looked at the workshop through the window for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "Your father is managing. He has a therapist coming 3 times a week and a physiotherapist on Tuesdays." I said I was glad to hear it. She said, "We are paying for it ourselves." I said I was glad to hear that too. She was quiet again. My mother had always communicated more in her silences than in her words, which was a quality I had spent years trying to decode and had only recently stopped finding exhausting. Then she said, "I did not know he was going to say those things at Patricia's." I said I believed her. She said, "I did not know he was going to say all those things about you over the years either. At dinners, at church, to Derek and to Patricia. I heard it and I did not stop it, and I told myself it was just how he was." I put my cup down. She said, "That is not an excuse." "I know it is not. I am telling you so you know I know." It was the most precise thing my mother had said to me in years, possibly ever. I understood what it cost her, and I did not minimize that cost by treating it as less than it was. I said, "I know, Mom." She nodded, then she asked if she could see the workshop. I took her through it. She moved carefully along the benches, looking at the movements in various states of disassembly, at the tools arranged in their order, at the small labeled drawers that held components, sorted by size and origin. She stopped in front of a bracket clock I was halfway through restoring, a beautiful piece in a fruitwood case with a silver dial and a pair of cherubs, cast in brass holding the bell above the movement. She said, "You always were careful with things." I said, "Yes." She touched the edge of the case lightly with one finger, not the dial or the mechanism, just the wood frame. Then she straightened and looked at me. She said, "Your father is going to want things to go back to the way they were. He is going to want you to come home, and he is going to use his health to ask for that, and he is going to believe he is not doing anything wrong." I said I knew. She said, "I am not going to ask you to do that." That sentence sat in the room for a moment. I said, "Thank you." She said, "I am going to ask you to call me sometimes, on the phone, just to talk. Not about money or problems. Just to talk." I said I could do that. She said good. Then she said Rosie had grown. I said she had. She left an hour later. I watched her car go down the street and felt something settle in me that I did not have an immediate name for. It was not resolution. Resolution suggests a clean ending, and there was nothing clean about any of it. It was closer to the feeling I had once, when a clock I had been working on for 3 months finally ran continuously for 24 hours without losing or gaining more than 2 seconds. Not triumph, more like a system finding its own true rate after a long adjustment. The clock tower project took 11 weeks from first assessment to final commissioning. The movement required more work than I had estimated, which is the nature of the work and why experienced conservators build contingency into their timelines. 3 of the wheel arbors needed to be repivoted. The pendulum suspension was damaged and required a replacement spring to a period-appropriate specification that I had to source from a supplier in the Netherlands. The click work was worse than it had looked in the initial assessment. Rosie came with me every weekend I worked on site. She learned the names of the major components. She learned how to hold a loop correctly. She sat in the clock room and read and watched, and occasionally handed me things I pointed to, with the focused reliability of a person who understood that concentration was a form of respect. On the day of the final test, the curator brought 2 members of the Historical Trust and the town's deputy mayor. Rosie stood beside me. I released the maintaining power. I set the pendulum in motion. I stood back. The first tick was not loud. These large movements do not clatter and bang the way people imagine. The sound was measured and steady, a beat that had not been heard in this room for 11 years. Filling the stone space with the particular authority of something restored to its purpose. Rosie grabbed my hand. The curator, who was a man in his 60s who had written grant applications and talked to committees for 11 years, turned away and stood by the window for a moment. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Rosie looked up at me and said, "There it is." I said, "There it is." People ask me sometimes whether I regret the way the Mother's Day brunch ended. The question is always shaped to suggest that I should, that a better daughter would have found a private moment, a gentler method, a version of the truth that preserved dignity on all sides. I have thought about this carefully. What I know is that private moments had existed in abundance for 5 years, and nothing had changed inside them. What I know is that the only language my family had ever heard clearly was the language of what I was willing to do and what I was not willing to do anymore. What I know is that Rosie was sitting beside me that morning, learning something about what her mother was and what her mother was worth, and I was not willing to teach her the lesson that my own childhood had taught me. The lesson that invisible labor is a virtue, that silence about sacrifice is a form of love, that a person who keeps a system running without recognition should be grateful for the system's continued existence. I will not teach her that. What I will teach her is what she already learned in an 11-week clock tower project in a town 3 hours from home. That something broken can be understood completely if you are willing to take it apart carefully enough. That time moves in one direction, and that the past cannot be recovered, only accounted for. That when a thing finds its true rate again after a long stop, the sound it makes is worth every hour of the work. My father and I speak occasionally now. The conversations are short and careful. He does not ask me for money. He does not perform grief about my emotional distance. He asks about Rosie. He tells me about his physiotherapy progress. Once he told me that his therapist had asked him to think about a time he had underestimated someone close to him and that he had thought of me. He did not elaborate, and I did not ask him to. It was enough that he had thought it. The bracket clock with the cherubs sold to a collector in Edinburgh who sent me a photograph of it on the mantelpiece of his library. It looks exactly right. Things that have been restored properly always look exactly right in the end, because the work is not about making something new. It is about returning something to what it actually was before it was neglected. I still have that figure, the total from the 5-year spreadsheet. I have not framed it the way I might frame something I was proud of, but I keep it because it is accurate, and because accuracy, I have learned, is its own kind of protection. They said I loved clocks more than people. What I loved was precision. I loved the idea that a system could be understood completely. I loved the knowledge that if something was not working correctly, there was always a reason. And the reason could always be found if you looked carefully enough, and once you found it, you could fix it. And once you fixed it, you could set it in motion again, and know exactly what you had. What I did not love was the version of family that only ran on my silence. That mechanism, I have retired. The clock tower runs. I have driven back twice to check its rate. Both times it was within acceptable tolerance. Both times Rosie asked to go up to the clock room and stand next to the pendulum and feel the air move when it swings. Both times I took her.